With the signing of Japan's surrender in 1945, the world turned its eyes to the remnants of its once feared military machine. Hidden deep in the jungles and mountains of the Pacific were bases, designed to defend an empire that no longer existed. The war was over, but the massive infrastructure remained, a silent burden. What became of these ghostly installations, from decaying tunnels to rusting airstrips? Some were abandoned and forgotten, while others were hastily repurposed. These sites, symbols of a bygone ambition, now stand as eerie reminders of Japan's imperial past. Some left to nature's relentless march, others turned into industrial hubs for a nation rebuilding from the ashes. The war was over. The bombs had ceased falling, the airfields no longer echoed with the roar of fighter engines, and the forests and jungles of the Pacific, once teeming with hidden fortresses, were still. In a moment of finality, the world shifted away from the fight and turned its gaze to the remnants of what had once been a terrifying military machine. The secret Japanese military bases, concealed deep within the islands, tunnels, and mountains of the Pacific, had been constructed to endure a war that never came to be. With the signing of the surrender in September 1945, they were abandoned, left to the mercy of time and the inevitable march of history. What would become of them? Some were stripped clean, others buried beneath the earth, and a few were simply forgotten, half-forgotten relics of a regime that no longer existed. A vast number of military installations, some of which had been state-of-the-art at their peak, lay dormant. Their purpose lost to the world and their existence fading with every passing year. These secret bases had been built with a singular purpose: to launch operations against invading forces, to create a defensive stronghold in the event of an Allied invasion, or even to house the means of conducting final desperate counterattacks in a war that had already turned decisively against Japan. But now, there was no enemy. There was no need. And yet, the infrastructure remained massive, entrenched, and expensive to maintain. The end of the war left the Japanese Empire not just with military defeat, but with a colossal logistical and economic burden: the maintenance of a military infrastructure that was suddenly obsolete and unsustainable. The immediate post-war years were marked by a frantic scramble to deal with these ghostly remnants of the past. Japan's shattered economy, racked by the cost of years of war and the devastation caused by bombings, was unable to support a military infrastructure that was both useless and costly. The bases, some of them scattered across remote islands in the Pacific, had been built with grandiose ambition, often at staggering costs. Now, they were an economic drain, and the question of what to do with them was more than just a military issue, it was a national one. Many of the military sites were in locations that made them impractical for future civilian use. With the Allied occupation forces securing the country, dismantling the war apparatus became a priority, but there was little time for careful preservation or even salvage. The focus of the occupation authorities was clear: Japan must never again become a military threat. Thus, the bases were treated not as historical artifacts, but as symbols of a past that had to be erased, wiped clean. The Imperial Japanese Army and Navy had left behind an intricate web of tunnels, bunkers, fortifications, and airstrips, many of which were now a heavy burden for a nation struggling to rebuild from the ashes. In some cases, military authorities in Japan, under the supervision of the Allied forces, began to dismantle the infrastructure piece by piece. Heavy machinery was used to tear down concrete bunkers, destroy airstrips, and remove any traces of military technology. Tunnels that once housed vital supplies, munitions, and troops were sealed off, often with little more than a thick wall of concrete, a hurried and final gesture to erase the legacy of the war. But these measures only scratched the surface of the problem. Some bases, built deep within mountain ranges or on isolated islands, were virtually impossible to access. For those, time would become the ultimate force of destruction. Abandoned, decaying, and left to nature, many of these sites remained largely untouched. The jungles of the Pacific began to reclaim what was once their own, slowly swallowing the concrete and steel, while the rust and corrosion of saltwater reduced the technology to mere husks of their former selves. In contrast, some sites were hastily repurposed. The occupation authorities were keen to ensure that Japan would never again be in a position to wage war. Some of the former military bases were transformed into Allied military installations, used to monitor the region and ensure that no remnants of militarism survived. Other bases, particularly those on the home islands of Japan, were converted into industrial zones or military training areas for the newly formed self-defense forces. Yet for all the repurposing, there were places that continued to exist as echoes of the war. The bases on remote Pacific islands, some of which had seen the most brutal fighting and had been built in the most extreme conditions, were now home to little more than abandoned weapons caches and rotting structures. The sailors, soldiers, and officers who had once called these bases home were gone, leaving nothing but empty concrete corridors and rusting machinery. In the emptiness, only the whispers of a war long past remained. The first steps in dealing with Japan's wartime infrastructure were both hasty and chaotic. The Allied occupation authorities, under General Douglas MacArthur, had no choice but to focus on the immediate economic and military restructuring of Japan. The dismantling of Japan's military was a monumental task. Some sites were simply beyond immediate repair or deconstruction, so they were left to nature, eroding and decaying over time. In remote locations, local inhabitants were often tasked with tearing down the remaining structures, either to reuse materials or simply to eliminate the remnants of the military presence. It was a grim and laborious process, as many of these bases had been designed to withstand all but the most determined attempts at destruction. The economic pressures on Japan in the aftermath of the war could not have been more severe. The Japanese economy was in ruins, with production capacity severely diminished, and the civilian infrastructure was all but destroyed. With an intense shortage of resources, the priorities of the Japanese government shifted quickly from military concerns to survival. The dismantling of the bases became a matter of necessity, not pride, and many of the bases, particularly those located in the far-flung reaches of the Pacific, were simply too expensive and impractical to maintain. These sites were left to decay, a silent testament to the failure of the imperial ambitions. By the early 1950s, with Japan's reconstruction efforts focused on economic recovery and political stabilization, the remnants of the wartime bases were largely forgotten. Few would have thought to preserve these sites as historical landmarks, and fewer still considered their eventual fate in terms of heritage or memory. Japan, in its rush to rebuild, did not look back. Instead, it faced forward toward its future. Yet, despite the rapid dismantling, some remnants of Japan's secret military bases remain today. From forgotten airstrips hidden within dense jungles to abandoned fortifications still standing on the most remote Pacific islands, these sites carry the weight of a bygone era. Many have decayed, some are preserved as curiosities or museums, and others remain hidden from the public eye, their stories largely untold. As the years passed, the last traces of these bases were either swallowed by nature or buried beneath the land. What began as grand military fortresses, designed to repel invaders and ensure Japanese dominance, had become, in the end, little more than a collection of faded memories, remnants of a war that had ended over half a century ago, but whose impact would remain etched in history forever. In the years following the end of World War II, the fate of Japan's secret military bases became increasingly entwined with the nation's broader efforts to recover from the devastation of the conflict. As the war ended in 1945, these bases, once symbols of ambition and power, stood as an enduring reminder of Japan's militaristic past. Though dismantled and forgotten by many, the remnants of these sites continued to exist, hidden in plain sight or buried beneath the relentless tide of time and nature. Yet, their post-war trajectory reveals more than just the physical decay of military infrastructure. It is a story of historical loss, of repurposing, and of the costs of a war whose consequences would ripple across decades. The immediate aftermath of Japan's surrender did not leave much room for reflection. There was no time to linger on the legacy of the war or its material remains. The urgency was to rebuild a nation whose economy had collapsed and whose population was devastated. The bases, scattered across hundreds of islands and remote locales, often built in isolated, rugged terrains, were seen not as monuments to a bygone military empire, but as inconvenient, expensive remnants of a defeated power. Japan's post-war government, under the supervision of the Allied occupation forces, had little capacity or interest in preserving or even cataloging these sites for future generations. The priority was to ensure that Japan would never again be capable of waging war. The Allied forces under General MacArthur were keen to ensure that Japan's military potential was completely nullified. This went beyond dismantling the armed forces. It meant dismantling the infrastructure that had supported Japan's war effort. The military bases, many of which had been built with tremendous cost and effort, were now considered not only useless but dangerous. In some cases, they were situated in strategic locations that, in the right hands, could once again be used to threaten the region. Thus, the task became not just a matter of erasing military power, but erasing a certain memory of Japan's imperial ambitions. The physical remnants of these bases became a silent battlefield between preservation and obliteration, a fight that was quietly waged without fanfare or recognition. In the immediate aftermath of the war, the process of dismantling Japan's secret bases was haphazard and rushed. The scarcity of resources and the sheer scale of the job meant that no single solution could address all the bases at once. Some sites were dismantled by hand, as the occupying forces or local inhabitants were tasked with tearing down structures, removing military equipment, and clearing the land. For those bases situated on the islands or in mountainous regions, this was a monumental task. The jungles of the Pacific, particularly in places like the Solomon Islands and New Guinea, slowly began to reclaim these abandoned military fortifications, with the rust of abandoned machinery and the erosion of concrete structures marking the passage of time. The cost of complete dismantling was too high for many of these bases, and instead, they were simply left to decay. At the same time, the nation's resources were stretched thin. Japan had little capacity to maintain or repair its damaged infrastructure, and with an economy in tatters, there was little to no funding available for anything but the essentials. The priority was clear: food, shelter, and basic industry had to take precedence. As a result, the country's once vibrant military installations, which had been centers of immense energy, planning, and production, were abandoned with little more than a final act of erasure, whether it was sealing off a bunker, destroying an airstrip, or simply leaving the remnants to be reclaimed by nature. The psychological effect of the war and its aftermath on Japan's population cannot be understated. The suffering and devastation caused by the conflict left the country in a state of collective trauma. Cities had been destroyed, families were torn apart, and the very fabric of society had been altered irreparably. For the people of Japan, the remnants of the war were not just physical structures. They were daily reminders of a time that had brought immeasurable suffering and loss. Many Japanese citizens were keen to leave the past behind, to look forward to the future and rebuild their shattered lives. The bases, then, became symbols of a past that was too painful to revisit. In many cases, they were forgotten, left to decay and be absorbed by the environment as the years passed. While much of the infrastructure was dismantled or left to the ravages of time, some sites underwent a different fate. As the Cold War began to take shape and the new geopolitical realities settled in, Japan found itself in a difficult position. The United States, now the occupying power, had its own interests in the region. Japan, although disarmed, was strategically important in the emerging standoff between the United States and the Soviet Union. In this context, some former military bases were repurposed for the needs of the United States military or for Japan's newly formed self-defense forces. The transition from military infrastructure to military necessity was a bitter pill to swallow for many, but it was, in many ways, a necessary compromise. Some of the Japanese military bases that had once been used for defensive purposes now became part of the American military presence in the Pacific. The bases, which had been designed to repel foreign invaders, were now part of a different kind of security architecture, one designed to monitor and counter the influence of the Soviet Union in East Asia. These transformations were not always seamless. The history of Japan's wartime imperialism and the political sensitivities of the post-war period meant that the United States had to tread carefully in how it utilized these sites. While some were repurposed into military training centers or logistical hubs, others were used to house American military personnel or to store supplies. Yet, even as these bases were repurposed, the question of what to do with the more remote sites remained. Many of the hidden airstrips, underground bunkers, and coastal fortifications were simply abandoned. The islands that had once played such a critical role in Japan's defense strategy now stood as eerie testaments to a time that had passed. Some of these sites, now reclaimed by dense jungle, were virtually inaccessible and remained undisturbed. The idea of salvaging the materials or preserving the infrastructure for historical purposes was, for most, an afterthought. There was no practical reason to maintain these bases, nor was there much interest in preserving them. And yet, the relics of war persisted. Some bases were indeed preserved, but not in the way one might expect. In a few cases, local authorities or private citizens saw the opportunity to repurpose the sites for new uses. Some of the airstrips were turned into commercial airports or used by private companies for mining or logging operations. Others were transformed into industrial zones, where remnants of Japan's wartime economy were recycled and put to use in rebuilding the country's civilian industries. Yet, these transformations often occurred with little fanfare. The bases, once so vital to Japan's military ambitions, had now been reduced to mere tools of industry or commerce, their original purpose forgotten. The most poignant reminder of Japan's wartime past lies in the bases that were simply left behind. These sites, once constructed with such ambition and precision, now exist in varying states of decay. Abandoned and forgotten, they serve as a grim reminder of a time when the world teetered on the edge of destruction. In places like the islands of Iwo Jima and Okinawa, the scars of war remain visible, both in the land and in the memories of those who lived through the conflict. The bases on these islands, while eventually closed and dismantled, hold a unique place in history, not just as military structures, but as symbols of sacrifice, tragedy, and the toll of war.